There is a saying among the Kryell assembly, passed down through 11 generations of conquest. A human alone is just a slow-dying animal. They believed it so completely that they never bothered to double-check. His name was Marcus Delgado, and when the Kryell warship dropped him on Station Cassandra 9, with nothing but a torn environment suit and 4 days of oxygen, they didn't even post a guard. Why would they? The station was dead. It had been dead for 30 years, a broken husk tumbling through a debris field on the edge of nowhere, stripped of its reactor core and left to rot as a monument to some forgotten war. The Kryell used it the way other species used unmarked graves, a place to put things they wanted to disappear. Marcus Delgado was a thing they wanted to disappear. His crime, according to the tribunal that never let him speak, was refusing to hand over the coordinates of a human refugee convoy hiding in the Outer Rim. 300 civilians, families, children. He'd been a mid-level logistics officer for the scattered remnants of Earth's fleet, a man who spent more time filing supply requisitions than firing weapons, and when the Kryell captured his transport and started asking questions, he simply didn't answer them. Not once. Not through 11 days of what they called persuasion. They found that more insulting than defiance, a logistics officer, a pencil pusher as his old crewmates used to tease him, and he'd outstubborned an interrogation team that had broken generals. So instead of executing him, which would have made him a martyr, the Kryell High Command decided on something crueler. They would let the Void do their killing for them. Dump him on a corpse of a station with no power, no food synthesizer, and 4 days of air, and let the silence finish the job. No blood on their hands. No story for humanity to rally around, just a man who vanished into the dark, the way so many had before him. The transport that dropped him didn't even stay to watch him die. It undocked, turned, and left him drifting in the vast cold nothing. Alone with a wrecked station and a countdown ticking down in the corner of his cracked helmet display, Marcus watched the Kryell ship shrink into a point of light and then disappear entirely. He didn't cry, he didn't scream into the comms that no one was listening to anymore. He'd done all his grieving already, back when they told him his wife hadn't made it off Earth during the evacuation, back when the war took nearly everything a person could lose. There wasn't much left in him to break. What was left, underneath the exhaustion and the bruises and the 4 days of oxygen ticking away in red numbers, was something quieter, something that had been quiet for a long time, and was only now in the absolute dark starting to stir. He looked at the station. Then he got to work. The first thing he found floating just inside the breached airlock was a dead man, in an ancient suit, a station engineer, who'd been marooned here decades ago, and never got out. Marcus didn't know his name. There was no ID left, no logs, nothing but bones in a suit, and a toolkit still clipped to his belt, perfectly preserved in vacuum. Marcus knelt beside him for a long moment. "Thank you," he said quietly, and took the tools. That was the whole eulogy. There wasn't time for more. The station's layout came back to him in pieces as he moved through it, because Marcus Delgado hadn't always filed requisitions behind a desk. Before the war swallowed everything, before Earth's fleet got scattered into desperate fragments, he'd spent 6 years as a structural engineer on orbital shipyards, the kind of job that taught you how stations breathed, how they died, and how, sometimes, you could bring them back. He'd traded that life for logistics, only because engineers were needed to keep supply lines running once the shipyards fell. Nobody on the tribunal had bothered to read that far into his file. They saw paper pusher. They never saw the 20 years before that the Kryell had a saying, and it turned out to be wrong. But Marcus had a saying too, one he kept to himself as he cracked open the first dead junction box and found, impossibly, a spark of residual charge still clinging to a capacitor bank. Everything broken was just something waiting to be useful again. He had 4 days of air. He decided quietly, without fanfare, that he intended to still be breathing on day 5, and on day 6, and for a long time after that. The first 18 hours he spent doing nothing but mapping. He moved through the station's corpse with his suit light as his only companion, cataloging every corridor, every sealed bulkhead, every room the vacuum hadn't fully claimed. Cassandra 9 had been built by a species he didn't recognize, boxy and utilitarian, clearly military in its bones, with 3 decks curled around a central spine that once housed a reactor long since gutted and stolen. Whoever stripped this station had taken the valuable things and left the rest to freeze. But they'd been in a hurry. They'd missed things. In a maintenance bay on the 2nd deck, he found an emergency oxygen reserve, sealed. Behind a bulkhead the scavengers hadn't bothered to force open, probably because the hydraulics were frozen and cracking. Marcus spent 6 hours prying it apart with a crowbar improvised from a support strut. When the seal finally broke and he heard the hiss of pressurized gas, he actually laughed, a short cracked sound inside his helmet, the first sound of joy he'd made in longer than he could remember. 4 days became 11. 11 days became a project. He rationed the air with the same cold precision he'd once used rationing supplies for a besieged fleet, calculating exactly how many hours he could spend on hard labor versus how many he needed to spend still. And calm, breathing slow, letting his body do less. He found a water reclamation unit in the station's lower ring, corroded but not destroyed, and spent 3 days coaxing it back to life with wiring salvage from dead consoles. He found ration bars in a sealed crew locker, decades old, chalky, and terrible, and ate them like they were a feast, because they were, he found on the 4th week, the first weapon. It wasn't much. A point defense turret, one of 6 that used to ring the station's hull, disconnected and half buried under a collapsed support beam in what used to be a hangar bay. The others had been cannibalized down to bare frames, but this one had been overlooked, tucked in shadow. Its housing cracked, but its firing mechanism intact. Marcus stood in front of it for a long time, his breath fogging faintly in his helmet, and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't examine too closely. He wasn't supposed to have a future. The Kryell had made that very clear. But nobody had told the station that, and nobody had told Marcus. He didn't smile often anymore, hadn't for years, but something in the set of his jaw changed as he looked at that turret. It wasn't hope, exactly. Hope was too soft a word for what a man feels when he realizes the tomb he's been buried in still has bones worth building with. It was more like intent. Weeks turned into months, and the months turned into a rhythm, because a man alone in the dark either finds a rhythm or he doesn't survive it. Marcus woke, checked his air and water levels, ate exactly enough to keep himself functional, and worked. He worked in the cold, in the dark, in the parts of the station where gravity was a rumor, and the parts where it crushed down twice as hard as it should have, because the artificial systems were only half functioning. He worked through the ache in his hands, through the loneliness that hit hardest in the hours he called night, purely out of habit, because the station had no day or night, only the same starless black pressing against every viewport. He talked to himself sometimes, not out of madness, but because silence. That total needed to be broken occasionally, or it started to feel like something else was in it with him. "You're not dying today," he told himself once, wrenching a fused bulkhead door with a hydraulic jack he'd built from scavenged parts. Not today, not for these people. He never fully explained, even to himself, who these people were. Maybe it was the refugee convoy he'd protected with his silence. Maybe it was his wife, gone before the evacuation ships even finished loading. Maybe it was every human who'd been written off the way the Kryell had written him off, treated like static instead of like a threat. Maybe it was just himself, the version of him that had almost given up in that interrogation cell, and hadn't, and wanted to prove that decision right. He found the reactor housing in month 3, a stripped, gutted chamber that once held whatever exotic power core had run this station. It was empty, scraped clean down to the mounting bolts. He stood in that chamber for a long time, running his light over the bare walls, and felt something close to despair. For the first time since he'd landed, a warship needed power. A station needed power. Without a core, everything he built would be a museum, not a weapon. But then he remembered the shuttle. It was wedged in a cargo bay he'd almost written off as unsalvageable, a small Kryell supply shuttle that had crashed into the station decades ago, during whatever battle had killed this place originally. Its hull was ruptured, its systems dead, but its drive core, small, inefficient by warship standards, but very much intact, sat in its housing like a gift nobody had bothered to notice. Marcus spent 11 days extracting it, rigging a pulley system out of station cabling to haul the core through corridors never designed for something that heavy sweating inside his suit until the visor fogged, despite the cold. When he finally seated that drive core into the station's ancient reactor housing and ran his first jury-rigged power test, the lights, some of them, in some corridors, flickered on for the first time in 30 years. He sat down right there on the cold deck plating and put his head in his hands, and for the first time since his wife's name had come up on a casualty list he never got to argue with, Marcus Delgado allowed himself to cry. It didn't last long. He had work to do. Power changed everything. With even a fraction of real electricity running through the station's veins, Marcus could do things that had been impossible before. He got the internal atmosphere processors limping back to life, which meant he no longer had to ration his suit's air so brutally. He got a workshop lathe humming, salvaged from a fabrication bay that had somehow survived the original scavengers, and started manufacturing the small components he needed instead of scrounging for them. He got, after nearly 5 months, a full sensor suite, operational, patched together from 4 different broken systems, and for the first time, he could see the debris field around the station, instead of just imagining it. That was when he found the graveyard. Scattered through the debris field, caught in slow orbits around Cassandra 9, were the wrecks of a dozen ships, casualties of whatever battle had gutted this station decades before Marcus was even born. Different hulls, different designs, some clearly Kryell, some from species he didn't recognize at all. All of them dead. All of them, to anyone else, worthless. To Marcus, they were a hardware store the size of a solar system. He started with the weapons. It took him 4 months just to identify what he was looking at, because Kryell weapon systems weren't built to be understood by outsiders, and the manuals, what few he found intact in the wrecked hulls, were written in a language his suit's translator only half understood. But Marcus had spent 6 years learning how machines wanted to work, how their logic held together, even when their labels didn't make sense, and slowly, piece by piece, he built a vocabulary. He learned which conduits carried power, and which carried coolant. He learned how their targeting arrays talked to their fire control systems. He learned, through trial and a few genuinely terrifying accidents, how not to vent an entire deck to vacuum by crossing the wrong wire. He pulled 3 intact plasma cannons from a wrecked Corvette and mounted them along the station's spine, rewiring their fire control into a jury-rigged console he built from 4 dead systems and a lot of stubbornness. He salvaged an entire point defense grid from a heavier cruiser wreck, 12 turrets in total, and spent 2 brutal months in a vacuum suit welding, mounting brackets to Cassandron's outer hull, 1 bolt at a time, his tether the only thing between him and the endless black. He didn't build the warship because he wanted to fight. He built it because it was the only language the people who dumped him here would ever understand. A logistics officer might beg. A logistics officer might apologize. But nobody ever again would look at Marcus Delgado and see something to be discarded. By month 7, Cassandra 9 had teeth. By month 9, it had a name, though only Marcus ever used it, painted crudely in white letters near the main airlock, in a language the Kryell couldn't read even if they'd cared to look. He called it The Undertaker. It felt right. A station built from a graveyard, armed with the bones of the dead, waiting patiently for the people who'd buried it alive to come check on the grave. He knew they would come. The Kryell were meticulous about their cruelty. They liked confirmation. Somewhere in their command structure there would be a report to file, a box to check, proof that the human they'd exiled had died the slow, humiliating death they intended for him. They would send a ship, eventually, to verify. Marcus didn't know when. But he had time, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had purpose. He spent his nights, what passed for nights, refining his targeting solutions, running drills against imagined threats, testing his jury-rigged fire control against debris he sent tumbling on remote thrusters. He was rusty. He hadn't held a weapons system since his shipyard days, and even then he'd been an engineer, not a gunner. But rust wears off with use, and Marcus used every hour he had. He thought about the refugee convoy sometimes. The 300 people he'd bled for in that interrogation room, and never met. He hoped they were still out there, still hiding, still alive. He thought about his wife, and the thoughts didn't hurt quite as sharp as they used to, because grief, given enough time and enough purpose, doesn't disappear, but it does learn to sit quietly instead of screaming. Mostly, though, he thought about the moment the Kryell ship would return. He didn't know exactly what he wanted from that moment. Not at first. Somewhere in the space, between month 9 and month 11, watching the debris field slowly turn to starlight through a viewport he'd personally rebuilt, he figured it out. He wanted them to understand, in the half-second, before it mattered, exactly how badly they had misjudged him. The Kryell confirmation vessel arrived on what Marcus's internal clock told him was day 341. It was not a warship. It didn't need to be. It was a light patrol cruiser, the kind of vessel the Kryell used for mundane tasks, tax collection from client species, routine surveys, and, apparently, confirming that condemned prisoners had died on schedule. Its captain was a mid-ranking officer named Kryell, a Kryell with a spotless service record and an utter absence of imagination, the kind of officer who had never once in his career questioned an order or wondered what happened after he stopped watching something die. Kryell expected to find debris, a frozen corpse drifting near a dead station maybe, if the vacuum hadn't already claimed the body entirely. He expected to log the confirmation, note the coordinates, and be back at his supper mess within the hour. He'd done this a dozen times for a dozen other prisoners on a dozen other forgotten stations, and every single time the result had been exactly what the tribunal ordered. Silence, stillness, confirmation of a death that barely required confirming. He did not expect his sensor officer to go rigid at her console and say, in a voice that cracked slightly at the edges, that Cassandra 9 was reading active power signatures. Kryell actually laughed. A short, dismissive bark. Faulty sensors, he said. The station's been dead for 30 years. Run a diagnostic. The diagnostic came back clean. The power signature was real. Puh! Kryell's laughter died. Somewhere in his throat, he ordered a visual sweep, expecting some malfunctioning automated system, a leftover reactor stub sparking uselessly into the dark. What his view screen showed him instead was a station bristling with weapon emplacements that had not existed in any survey on record, running lights along its spine, a targeting array clearly active and clearly tracking his ship, and, mounted with crude defiant pride near the main airlock, a name painted in human lettering that his translator rendered. After a slight delay, as The Undertaker. For a long moment, nobody on the bridge said anything at all. Then, a channel opened, unrequested, from the station itself, and a voice came through that Kryell recognized from the prisoner's file. Calm, quiet, entirely without fear. "You're late," Marcus said. "I expected you months ago." Kryell's mandibles clicked in something between confusion and outrage. "This is impossible," he said, more to his own bridge crew than to the channel. "This station was stripped. This station was dead." "It was," Marcus agreed. "I brought it back." Kryell stared at the screen, at the sensor readings that refused to make sense no matter how many times his crew ran them, at the 12 active point defense turrets, and the 3 plasma cannons and the targeting lock that had settled onto his hull, with the patient certainty of something that had been waiting a long time for exactly this moment. "You are one human," Kryell said, and something in his voice had shifted from outrage to something closer to disbelief. One human, alone, with no support, no resupply, no reinforcement. "Yes," Marcus said, "you should be dead." "I should be a lot of things," Marcus said. "I've had 341 days to think about all of them." Kryell's tactical officer leaned toward him, voice low and urgent, and reminded him that their vessel was a light patrol cruiser, unarmed, beyond minimal point defense, entirely unequipped to engage whatever this station had become. Kryell already knew that. He could see it on every readout in front of him. What he could not process, what his entire framework of understanding refused to accept, was how it had happened at all. "You had 4 days of air," Kryell said, as if reciting the fact might undo it. "You had no tools, no allies, no resources." "I had a graveyard," Marcus said, "and a lot of time and every reason in the galaxy to make sure the next people who came looking for a corpse found something else. Instead, Thren ordered his ship to retreat. It was, in the grand scheme of Kryell military history, an entirely reasonable decision. His vessel had no weapons capable of meaningfully engaging a station with active plasma cannons and a full-point defense grid. Discretion was the correct tactical choice, and Thren, whatever else could be said about him, was not a stupid officer. He was, however, exactly the kind of officer who reported failures upward instead of sitting on them. Because covering up an anomaly this large would end his career the moment anyone else discovered it. So he sent his report exactly as he'd witnessed it, verbatim, including the recording of Marcus's voice, up the Kryell chain of command, all the way to the regional fleet command that had ordered Marcus's exile in the first place. The officer who received that report was a fleet commander named Ves Orton, a decorated war hero with 3 campaign medals and absolutely no tolerance for what he perceived as impossible nonsense from a junior patrol captain. Ves watched the recording twice. He listened to Marcus's calm, quiet voice describe rebuilding a warship from scrap metal and corpses, and he decided, with the particular arrogance of a man who has never personally been wrong about anything, that this was either an elaborate hoax or a criminally incompetent censor reading. He decided to handle it personally because Ves Orton did not believe in problems that couldn't be solved by sending enough firepower at them. He requisitioned 3 warships from the regional garrison, a light cruiser and 2 heavy escorts, more than enough, by any reasonable calculation, to obliterate a single derelict station manned by one malnourished human with delusions of competence. He did not consult the tribunal that had exiled Marcus in the first place, because, as far as Ves was concerned, this wasn't about justice or punishment anymore. It was about a stain on the record of Kryell military supremacy. A single data point that suggested their judgment could be wrong, and Ves intended to erase that data point personally, permanently, and with maximum firepower. He set course for Cassandra 9 with the settled confidence of a man who had never once considered that the universe might not bend to his assumptions. Marcus watched them coming for 6 hours before they arrived, tracking their approach on sensors he'd rebuilt with his own hands, in a station he'd rebuilt with his own hands, armed with weapons he'd rebuilt with his own hands. He felt something settle in his chest as the 3 ships grew from distant blips into clear hull signatures. Not fear, he'd used up his fear a long time ago, in an interrogation cell refusing to give up 300 names and coordinates. What was left now was simply readiness. The particular calm of a man who has spent 341 days preparing for exactly this moment, and finally gets to stop preparing and start acting. He ran through his systems one final time. Plasma cannons charged and ready. Point defense grid fully operational, tracking solutions locked. Reactor output stable thanks to a Kryell drive core. The Kryell themselves had left behind without a second thought. Every single piece of the weapon bearing down on their approaching fleet had been built from parts the Kryell discarded, dismissed, or forgot. There was a poetry to that Marcus intended to make very, very clear before this was over. He opened a channel before they even hailed him. Ves Orton's face appeared on the screen, broad and confident. The face of a man who had never lost a fight he'd chosen to start. "Human," he said, without preamble. "You have caused an unacceptable disruption to Kryell administrative order. Surrender the station and yourself for immediate termination, and I will consider mercy toward whatever remains of your species in the Outer Rim." Marcus studied him for a moment, unhurried. "You sent me here to die quietly," he said. "I did the opposite. That's not an administrative disruption. That's a math problem you got wrong." Ves's expression didn't shift, which told Marcus everything he needed to know about how this conversation was going to end. "You are one man," Ves said. The same disbelief Thren had voiced months earlier, now dressed up in a general's confidence instead of a captain's confusion. "One man cannot outbuild 3 warships." "I didn't build 3 warships," Marcus said. "I built one station that's been waiting 341 days for someone to give it a reason." Then he ended the channel, because there was nothing left worth saying, and the Kryell fleet opened fire 4 minutes later. The first volley came in hard and fast, 3 ships coordinating their fire on Cassandra 9's spine, and for one heart-stopping second Marcus felt the entire station shudder under the impact. Alarms shrieking through every deck he'd spent a year rebuilding. But he'd reinforced that spine with salvaged hull plating from 4 different wrecks, layered and welded by his own hands during nights he didn't remember choosing to stay awake for. And the shielding held, barely, but it held. He returned fire. His plasma cannons, 3 of them, salvaged from a dead corvette, mounted with brackets he'd forged himself, tracked the lead heavy escort with targeting solutions he'd spent months perfecting against imaginary threats that had finally become real. The first shot clipped the escort's forward shielding and staggered it. The second, fired 11 seconds later, once his jury-rigged capacitors recharged, punched clean through its weakened hull, and the ship convulsed with a secondary explosion that lit up the black in a burst of white fire. 1 down. Bess's voice crackled back over the comms, no longer confident, edged now with something closer to disbelief, curdling into rage. Impossible tracking accuracy for a single operator, he snarled, more to his own crew than to Marcus. Redirect all fire to the primary spine, concentrate everything. He never finished the order. Marcus's point defense grid, 12 turrets, scavenged from a dead cruiser and mounted 1 bolt at a time in the crushing silence of vacuum, opened up on the incoming fighters Vess had launched to finish the job as capital ships couldn't. The fighters, small and fast, were built to overwhelm a target through sheer numbers, and against most defenses that tactic would have worked. But Marcus had spent months running drills against exactly this scenario, tracking debris tumbling on remote thrusters, until his targeting solutions could account for evasive maneuvers before the enemy even attempted them. 6 fighters went out in the first exchange. Not damaged, gone. Vess's remaining heavy escort tried to break off, tried to put distance between itself and a station that was behaving nothing like the corpse it was supposed to be. But Marcus had learned this station's spine intimately, every conduit, every capacitor, every weld he'd made himself. And he knew exactly how much power he could push through his plasma cannons if he stopped worrying about conserving them for a longer fight. "There isn't going to be a longer fight," he said quietly, to no one, and fired everything he had. The heavy escort's shields collapsed under the combined barrage, and its hull followed a half-second later, folding inward before the reactor breach turned the whole ship into a brief, violent star. That left Vess's own cruiser, the largest of the 3, still firing, still trying, still operating on the assumption that enough firepower thrown at a problem would eventually solve it. Marcus took 2 more hits across his hull during the exchange, and somewhere on deck 3, an atmosphere seal cracked and started venting, an alarm he heard and noted and set aside because there wasn't time to fix it yet, and there was absolutely time to finish this. He redirected every remaining turret, every plasma cannon, every scrap of power his stolen Kryell drive core could push through the station's rebuilt veins into a single sustained barrage on Vess's flagship. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the kind of tactical brilliance a war college would teach. It was the brute, patient logic of a man who understood, better than anyone in that Kryell fleet, exactly what every discarded piece of hardware in this debris field was still capable of doing. Vess's cruiser's shields flared, buckled, and failed within 90 seconds. The final volley took out its primary reactor housing, and the ship that had come to erase an impossible data point from the record became, instead, additional evidence for it, tumbling apart in silent fire against the black. The whole engagement had lasted 11 minutes. Marcus sat in the command chair he'd built from a Kryell command console and a salvaged flight seat, and for a long moment he simply breathed, listening to the alarms slowly quiet, as automated systems sealed the breach on Deck 3, listening to his own heartbeat settle from the frantic hammering of combat back down to something steady. He looked at the wreckage drifting outside his viewport. 3 Kryell warships reduced to debris that would join the graveyard he'd already scavenged once, and he felt no triumph. Exactly. Triumph would have required surprise, and he hadn't been surprised. He'd known with the same quiet certainty he'd known back on day 1 that he wasn't going to simply lie down and die, that this was always how it would end, once he decided to make it in that way. What he felt instead was something closer to peace. He didn't celebrate. There was no crew to celebrate with, no cheering bridge crew slapping him on the back, no band playing him into a hero's welcome. There was just Marcus, alone, in a station he'd built with his own hands out of a graveyard that Kryell had discarded, breathing in air he'd reclaimed himself, in a chair, surrounded by silence that, for the first time in 341 days, felt earned instead of imposed. He allowed himself exactly one dry, tired laugh, the kind of laugh a man gives when the universe finally catches up to a joke he's been carrying alone for a very long time. "Should have sent a bigger fleet," he said to the empty bridge. Then he got up, because Deck 3 needed repairs, and repairs, more than anything else, were a language Marcus Delgado understood. Word of what happened at Cassandra 9 did not stay contained within Kryell Command, no matter how badly Vesorton's superiors wanted it to. Threnkal, the patrol captain who'd first discovered the station wasn't dead, had already filed his report through proper channels before Ves ever seized control of the response. And that report, along with the recording of Marcus's voice, had been copied, forwarded, and quietly leaked by more than one junior officer who found the entire situation less embarrassing than fascinating. It reached human ears first through a fringe communications relay, operated by exactly the kind of scattered rebel network Marcus had once bled to protect, a network that had spent the better part of a year believing its silent logistics officer was long dead. When the recording surfaced, garbled and partial, but unmistakably his voice, unmistakably his station, something moved through the remnants of humanity's scattered fleet that hadn't moved in a long time. Not quite hope. Something steadier than hope. Proof. Proof that one man, given nothing, could still build something the enemy couldn't ignore. The refugee convoy Marcus had protected, with his silence, the 300 civilians whose coordinates he'd carried through 11 days of interrogation and never once surrendered, heard that recording too. They didn't know his face. Most of them had never known his name. But when their convoy's captain played that recording for the whole ship, a woman who had lost her husband in the same evacuation that took Marcus's wife stood in the mess hall and cried, quietly, for a man she had never met and would never properly thank. Cassandra became, in the months that followed, something the Kryell Assembly did not want to acknowledge and could not entirely ignore. Official communications referred to it obliquely, if at all, as an unresolved administrative matter in the Outer Rim. Unofficially, among the officers who actually flew patrol routes anywhere near that debris field, it became something closer to legend, a station you gave a wide berth, a graveyard that had grown teeth, and remembered exactly who had put it there. Marcus didn't seek out the attention. He wasn't interested in being a symbol. But symbols have a way of finding people whether they want the job or not, and within a year, small, careful groups of human refugees, drawn by rumors and static-choked recordings, passed hand-to-hand across the Outer Rim, began finding their way to Cassandra 9, not as tourists, but as people looking for a place that had already proven it could survive against impossible odds. Marcus welcomed the first family with the same quiet, unshowy competence he'd brought to every wire. He'd spliced in every turret he'd mounted. He gave them a berth, showed them the water reclamation system he'd rebuilt, explained, without any drama, which sections of the station were safe and which still needed work. He didn't ask for gratitude. He'd built the station to survive, not to be thanked, and the fact that it had become something worth living in, rather than just something worth fighting from, was to him the quieter and more important victory. More came. A handful of engineers who'd heard how he'd resurrected a dead reactor and wanted to understand how. A retired fleet tactician who studied the recording of the battle for weeks before showing up in person just to shake his hand, and stayed to help refine the station's defenses. A widow with 2 children who simply needed somewhere safe, and found, in Marcus, someone who understood exactly what that kind of loss cost a person without ever needing her to explain it. He never remarried. He never fully stopped grieving his wife the way people who tell you grief has an ending are usually people who haven't grieved anything that mattered. But he built something in her memory that felt to him like an answer to the war that took her. Not vengeance, exactly. though there had certainly been vengeance in those 11 minutes against Vesorton's fleet. Something more like defiance carried forward into permanence. A place his wife would have recognized as exactly the kind of thing he would build. Given time, given tools, given a reason. The Kryell assembly, for its part, never sent another confirmation vessel. There was, after all, nothing left to confirm. The tribunal that had exiled him quietly buried its own records rather than explain to its superiors how a punishment designed to erase a man had instead built him a fortress. Vesorton's death was recorded, eventually as a navigational accident in a hazardous debris field, a lie so thin that everyone who mattered in Kryell command knew exactly what it meant and chose, out of self-preservation, never to say so aloud. Thren Kao, oddly, was the only Kryell officer who ever returned to Kessendranen nearly 2 years after his first visit, flying alone in an unarmed shuttle under a flag of parley that Marcus, watching him approach on rebuilt sensors, chose to honor. Thren didn't come to fight. He came, he said, standing awkwardly in the station's rebuilt command deck, because he'd spent 2 years unable to stop thinking about a station that shouldn't have existed, built by a man who should have died in 4 days, and he needed, for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to himself, to understand how. Marcus told him. All of it. The dead engineer in the airlock. The drive core salvaged from a crashed shuttle. The 11 months of silence and cold and stubborn, patient work. Thren listened without interrupting, and when Marcus finished, the Kryell officer sat quietly for a long moment before saying, with something that might have been the beginning of respect, that his people had a saying about humans that he now understood to be catastrophically wrong. Most sayings are, Marcus told him. That's usually how you find out what's actually true. Thren left peacefully. He never became an ally. Exactly, not in any way that mattered strategically, but he never came back with a fleet either. And in the years that followed, patrol routes near Cassandra 9 grew quietly, deliberately sparse, as if an unspoken agreement had settled over that stretch of the outer rim. Leave the station alone. Leave the man alone. Whatever he'd built there, it had already cost more than it was worth to test twice. Cassandra 9 grew, slowly, into something between a fortress and a home, a scattered community of humans who had lost everything the war could take from them and found, in a dead station brought back to life, a reason to keep building instead of just surviving. Marcus taught them what he knew, how machines wanted to work even when their labels didn't make sense, how to find value in things everyone else had already thrown away, how grief, given enough time and enough purpose, could learn to sit quietly instead of screaming, and leave room underneath it for something like a future. He still worked with his hands most days, because some habits outlast the reasons that built them. He still checked the station's defenses every single morning, out of a discipline that had become as natural to him as breathing, though the checks had grown quieter, more routine, less like preparation for a battle, and more like the quiet maintenance of a peace-eater in the hard way. Sometimes in the hours he still privately thought of as night, he stood at the viewport nearest the command deck and looked out at the debris field that had once been a graveyard and was now, in its own strange way, a foundation. Somewhere out there, drifting slower now, were the bones of the ships that tried to erase him, mixed in among the bones of the ships that had, without ever meaning to, given him everything he needed to refuse. He thought, sometimes, about the tribunal that exiled him, the officers who had looked at a quiet logistics man and seen nothing worth fearing. He wondered if any of them had ever learned what became of the punishment they were so certain would kill him, quietly. He hoped they had, not out of cruelty, out of a simpler, steadier need. The need every person who has ever been underestimated eventually feels, to know that somewhere the truth had finally caught up with the lie. They thought a dead station would bury a man they'd already decided didn't matter. Instead, the man rebuilt the station, and in doing so, buried the lie that he never mattered at all. If you enjoyed watching one quiet, underestimated man turn a graveyard into a fortress and a punishment into a home, you know exactly what to do. Leave a like, drop a comment telling me which moment hit hardest, whether it was the dead engineer's toolkit, the reactor coming back to life, or those 11 minutes against a fleet that thought bigger automatically meant better. subscribe, and ring the bell if you want more stories about humans who get thrown away and come back sharper, stronger, and a great deal harder to bury. There are more tales like this one coming. So until next time, keep your eyes on the stars and never underestimate the quiet ones.